Hey there, art nerds! I've got another color along with me tutorial for you guys today. I have a printable line art that's free to my patrons over on Patreon, and I'm going to show you guys how to color it with alcohol markers. If you're one of my patrons though, you don't feel like you have to use alcohol markers for this one. I just thought this Cherry Girl illustration really lent itself to bright, vibrant colors. I'm using a mix of my favorite alcohol markers today, so that would be the Blick Studio brush markers, Copic markers, and Prismacolors, but you can use whatever markers or media make your heart sing. So grab your paper, grab whatever art supplies you're using for today's color along with me, and let's get started. For this illustration, I wanted to do a colored line art, and for that I'm using Tombow's Fudenosuke brush pens. These are waterproof and alcohol marker safe brush pens. They come in a variety of colors, including fun neons, and you can find them a lot of different places actually, from Michael's to Walmart to Amazon. I'm going to have a link down in the description below for all the materials that you're going to need for today's tutorial. I am inking on Strathmore 300 series Bristol, so this is their good series but not their best series, and it is the smooth texture. I find that this paper plays really well for the kind of marker techniques that I'm going to be using today. And I went ahead and I made notes on that little post-it that you guys saw earlier what colors I wanted everything to be, because that's going to make it a lot easier for me to do a colored line art. So colored line arts are pretty straightforward. You basically figure out the local color or the main color of what you're drawing, and you go ahead and you ink it with that. You figure out what the highlights are, and you might use the next lightest color. So for this example, we're inking her hair with red. We might use orange or yellow for the highlights if we want to, and we figure out what the next darkest color would be. So in this case, purple, and we use that to ink the shadows or the lower layers. You can use as many colors as you want for your colored line art. You can use contrasting colors and get some color vibrance going on there, and you don't have to limit yourself to these particular brush pens. Sakura makes colored technical pens that are also really great, and I believe Kuretake makes the Cambio Tambian brush pens that I reviewed for you guys not super long ago that are water safe and still vibrantly colored. Akashi Asai also makes these beautiful muted tones if you wanted to do some slightly more subdued line art. Basically, the world of art supplies is your oyster, and if you're interested in inking your own line arts, then you've got a lot of different options. Something I've seen other artists doing as well is going ahead and printing out their line art. So this was a digital sketch that I printed out as blue lines. They print their line art dark enough, and then they just marker on top of that. That's a technique I'm definitely going to have to try in the future. So the thing about inking by hand is that if we make a mistake, we can't fix it right now. We can't undo it. To an extent, you can kind of hide it with how you handle your markers, and then maybe later on go over and cover it up. But we're basically stuck with it for the time being. That used to be really nerve-wracking for me, but after years of practice, I'm pretty confident in it. However, one thing I do to kind of increase my chances of success is, rather than just inking straight on top of the blue lines, I go ahead and I pencil it. I tighten up my illustration so that it's easier for me to see, and it's also easier for you guys to see, because the camera doesn't really like to pick up the blue lines too much, and sometimes it can look like I'm just inking straight onto white paper. So I go ahead and pencil it, and that way I have a really good idea of where everything's going to be, and I also make notes beforehand about what colors I want to use. Art is 80% thinking about the project in preparation, and then 20% actually doing the thing. So if you're an artist and you find that you're often making these avoidable mistakes or poorly thought out choices, or everything is done on a whim, while that can be a lot of fun, and I don't want to like totally take that away from you, if you spent a little bit more time envisioning what you want the end piece to look like, even just the colors, and maybe doing some color samples or some color swatches, I think you'll find that you have a higher success rate. So since inking something like this where we can't afford to make mistakes is slightly higher stress, I recommend you put on some chillaxing music, something that you enjoy, something that you kind of vibe to. If you enjoy metal, go for it and put on metal. I was probably listening to baby metal while inking this, but whatever you find relaxing. And I would actually recommend not holding a conversation with somebody while you're inking, because I find that if I'm talking while I'm inking, it really negatively impacts how I pull those lines, and my lines get a lot more wobbly. So basically, I try to pull the lines towards me using the majority of my arm, so from the elbow to the wrist rather than using my fingers, especially for those longer lines. I use a buffer sheet like this one to avoid getting oils on the paper and to avoid smearing the ink, because that's a big one. If I'm going to make a mistake, it's going to be printing ink print marks from my hand all over the paper. And so just a sheet of copier paper can help prevent that kind of smearing. And I also try to pull my lines all in one go rather than, little bitty touch-up lines. And I try to pull my lines as I'm breathing, so either breathing in or breathing out. And that's why I say talking or having a conversation while I'm inking can really disrupt the in process, can really disrupt the in line. So it does get a little bit boring and a little bit lonely, I won't lie, because it becomes very isolating. But I can do it a lot quicker if I just concentrate on what I'm doing. Now, if I do need to have a conversation or focus on something else for a little while, I stop what I'm doing, focus on that, and then come back to this, which I know for those of us with really busy lives, that's really difficult to do. And often I find myself inking pieces like this really late at night when I've finished everything else, which doesn't result in my best art, but it does mean I need to invest more time in actually thinking about what I'm doing beforehand, because I'm going to be tired and I'm not going to be making the greatest decisions. So I try to make those decisions before, while my brain is still fresh, and that way I can kind of just do the thing when I actually have time to do the thing, which tends to be later at night when I'm tired. Sometimes after I have those initial layers inked in, I'll let it dry for a while and kind of think about it and come back in and add more shadows, bump up some of those line arts, and just kind of refine the art a bit. So another huge key to preventing smearing is to allow your inks to cure, to dry onto the paper for 24 hours. And then I use a soft white vinyl eraser to erase the pencils. And then after I've erased the pencils, I scan it so I can share it with my awesome patrons over on Patreon. Oh boy, we've got a color grading shift here, huh? So the first part was recorded while I still lived in Norco, and I had a very different lighting situation, and we're still trying to figure out the lighting situation in the new house. So things are going to change a whole lot between now and when it's finally done. So generally, I like to swatch out my potential colors using a sheet of the same paper. So in this instance, it's a scrap of the Strathmore 300 series paper. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm using a mix of alcohol markers. You can use whatever markers you like, but I'll go ahead and give you guys the markers that I'm using in case you happen to have them. I'm using a mix of Prismacolor, Blick Studio Brush markers, and Copic markers. That's one of the reasons why when I review alcohol markers, it's really important for me to figure out if they actually play nice with other alcohol markers. Rather than go over all the colors that I use here, you'll find them listed out in the description below. But basically, I find that Blick Studio Brush and Prismacolor fill in some of the gaps that are in my Copic marker collection. If you're looking for some really good, high quality alcohol markers that are refillable and have replaceable nibs, the Blick Studio Brush markers are fantastic. I've reviewed the Artify, I reviewed the Art and Fly, I've reviewed the Ohuhu, I reviewed a lot of cheap alcohol markers, and while some of them I can recommend, if you're really into alcohol markers and you're looking for something that's going to make you happy for a longer period of time and have longer use, the Blick Studio brush markers are really going to fill that niche for you. So I can't really recommend them enough. Unfortunately, Prismacolor markers are not refillable, but they do tend to last a really long time. And I pre-ordered the OLO markers that are so interesting, and I've already started working on the review for them, although I haven't gotten them yet. So if you're interested in even more alcohol marker reviews, keep an eye on this space because I do have more coming. I've been trying to kind of narrow it down, since I buy them out of pocket using funds from Patreon, to just a few select companies that actually seem to be offering something unusual or different. So that's why I don't review every white label alcohol marker on the market. So here is my finished swatch sheet. This is kind of a map of the colors that I want to use for this illustration, testing them out because you can't just trust the color chips, and making sure that they actually work. So not shown, I applied strips of MT washi tape, so white high quality masking tape, all around this image to create a white border. This is one of the best white masking tapes I've found. So if you like using masking tape to create crisp, clean borders like this, or if you use masking tape to tape down your watercolor illustrations to whatever you're painting on, MT washi tape is where it's at. I'm going to do a few layers of kind of a light purple. I'm going for early 90s, late 80s sort of vibes. Down here in Louisiana, we're always a little bit behind the rest of the country in terms of trends. So my memories of the 90s are probably very colored by the 80s. And I'm going for kind of an ombre gradient effect where it's darker at the bottom and lighter at the top. And then I've also got these fun early 90s, late 80s squiggles. To further lighten my alcohol marker, I'm also spritzing some 99% isopropyl alcohol on it. That's going to push some of those colors to the back of the paper, because that's how alcohol markers blend, is they basically, the solvent in the marker basically pushes the dye-based color towards the back of the paper so you can put more layers on it, which is one of the reasons I also prefer to color on more absorbent marker papers. And I'm really trying to build up my colors while also ensuring that my gradient is fairly smooth. And the way I do that is I used the last color that I used. I don't use the colorless blender. In fact, I think for this piece, I didn't use the colorless blender at all, which is kind of weird for me. But I used the prior color to kind of blend it out, because if you use the colorless blender, it can sometimes cause this weird sort of transition color in between the two. I spritz it again with our isopropyl alcohol to get kind of a neat spray effect, and then I start working on her eyes. So for the whites of her eyes, I'm using B00 and 008. I'm also using the same colors for anything white on this illustration, so that goes for her teeth as well. Now for her skin, I'm starting with PB24, a really, really light peachy color. And I'm gonna do kind of some overall coverage on here. Like I said a little bit earlier, I'm not using the colorless blender at all for this piece. That wasn't an intentional choice, it's just something I ended up doing. Something else is that I end up revising the colors quite a bit in this piece after sleeping on it and coming back to it the next day. So if you don't like an illustration that you're working on, it's not quite going the way you want it to, sometimes taking a break from it and sleeping on it can really help you make better decisions. So the next color is E000, and I'm slowly building up those colors layer by layer and leaving islands of the prior color, and that can be blended out with that same prior color. Next is 242. So when I'm selecting colors or markers that work well together, I'm looking for markers that are fairly juicy, markers that have colors that might be missing in some of the other marker sets that I have. So markers that bring new colors to the table. I'm also looking for really nice, bouncy brush style marker nibs. So I don't like fiber brush nibs. Some people do, I don't. I find they tend to get really mushy and they tend to bleed a lot. I'm really looking for soft foam rubber, something with some resiliency and something that can ideally keep up with the ink flow that I need for these larger illustrations. Next, I've started applying a layer of blush, and I'm using 079 for that. And I'm applying it on the cheeks, the lips, above the eyes, underneath the neck. So basically anywhere I want there to be a little bit of flush, or where I'm layering skin on top of skin. And to soften the transition, I kind of blended it out with the last color we used, so that would be 242. And then I'm going to add another layer of blush, this time R02, blend that back out with our prior color, 079, and just kind of work back and forth like that. And then I'm adding in a layer of skin tone shadow using E11. And that kind of depends on what art style you're going for, how realistic you want it to be. I've noticed that people who have more realistic marker styles tend to go for sort of more desaturated browner shades to shade their characters and to shade their art, whereas people who grew up watching a lot of anime and reading a lot of manga tend to go for more saturated, pinkish colors. I fall somewhere kind of strangely in between. So for her freckles, I'm using E13 and E34, and I'm also going to use E13 to add in some more shading to our skin and get some more contrast. So for her hair, I'm starting with a really light pink color. I want kind of like a coral color for her hair. And I'm starting with Blix 133. And since it's such a light color, I'm not leaving any white highlights because I don't feel like those would be particularly noticeable with such a light pink. And as I'm coloring in her hair, I'm not just coloring it like straight up and down. I'm trying to move in the direction of the hair. And this is one of the reasons I really like these kind of brush tip markers, is they allow for more expressive marker work than the bullet tips. They're also a lot easier on my arthritis. So next I'm going in with 003, and I am starting to leave in some white highlights. I'm really letting the brush on this marker do a lot of the work for me. I also do watercolor art, so a lot of the techniques that I like in watercolor are techniques that I'm going to bring into my alcohol marker illustration and vice versa. I like both media because they're both transparent media that really allow the colors and the color of the paper to influence your end work. That said, while I love alcohol markers, they are a dye-based medium and they are very light fugitive. So if you're creating alcohol marker work to sell or to display, or if you're buying alcohol marker art to display, do keep in mind that you should display it in an area that doesn't get a lot of direct sunlight, and that the colors may change and shift over time. So the next color I'm using in her hair is R01. And as you guys can see, now that the camera's finally able to pick some of this up, I'm leaving larger and larger islands as I go. And I'm also coloring in her eyelashes and her eyebrows with the same colors. And I'm building up those colors at the same pace that I'm building up her hair. Next up is 064. So something that I really prize about Blick Studio brush markers is that they're expanding their marker catalog. So while they don't have the largest selection of colors, they're always adding new colors. So that's pretty exciting. And it's also neat that they offer colors that aren't really available in Copic at kind of half the price of Copic, or at least the Copic sketches. Copic chows are almost half the price of Copic sketches. And the reason you don't see a lot of Copic chows is that I mostly collected my Copic markers before chows were introduced. If I had started a little bit later, you'd be seeing a lot of chows because they're refillable. You can replace the nibs and they're much cheaper. So I think they're a great option for people who like the Copic color catalog and they like some of the options available with Copics, but they don't want to spend $5 to $6 per marker. So the Blick Studio brush markers are affordable. The only real downside, in my opinion, is that you can only get them from Dick Blick, so either in person or online. You can't just go to like a Michael's or another art supply store and find the Blick Studio brush markers. It's their store brand, but pretty dang cool for a store brand. I also really like Prismacolor markers because they have some really good purples and teals and yellows that are just not really available in Copic. So my next color, it looks like I'm doing another layer of 064. So a cool thing about alcohol markers is you can basically build up 3 layers of tone. And I have tutorials where I really talk about this and where I talk about blending triads, where you can create a really vibrant saturated marker illustration with only 3 colors, not 3 colors total, but 3 colors to build up your forms. I hope you guys will check it out. I'll link it for you guys down in the description below. I have also got some really great intro to alcohol marker tutorials that I think you guys will enjoy. So to add in some shadow, I am using, and I didn't write it down because I am super duper smart, but it is one of the Blick Red Violet colors. And I went with this because it's a more saturated shadow color. So it's going to add some fun and some vibrancy while still reading as shadow. And to kind of blend it back a little bit, I'm using E34 just to kind of soften that transition. So it's not like wabam purple on her skin. So next I'm using Copic R05 to add in some of the darkest shades, darkest layers of color to her hair and her eyebrows and her eyelashes. I was really going for kind of like a corally pink anime girl kind of hair color. So not something you would necessarily see in real life, but something that's very cute and very flattering. And you guys can really see the marker strokes here and why I'm so really reliant on using that brush tip in order to get the kind of marker effects that I want. Different marker artists have different needs, and working in a larger size like this, you've got a lot of paper to cover. So having those brush tips or having Copic wides or having spray alcohol inks can be really helpful. I want to apologize that it didn't capture me working on her eyes. I thought it was recording and it wasn't. I do have tutorials on how to color anime style eyes using alcohol markers, so I'll link those for you guys. I went with 2 different kind of color schemes for her eyes. So for her irises, I used B21, B32, 018 and PB 145, so starting out with warmer blues going towards purple. And then for her irises, or the center of her eyes, I started with PB 44, then PB 127, then 073, and finally PB 57 to really build up those kind of warmer blues and purples, and to give like a nice, not quite a contrast color, because teal would have been a good contrast color if we were going for that, but I was going with kind of like warmer nostalgic tones for her hair and eyes. So for her shirt, I was initially torn between using yellow or like a lime green for her shirt. I eventually settled on lime green, so I'm starting with YG quadruple 0 as a base color for her shirt, and then I'm moving on to YG 00. And then from there, I'm going to use 042. So 2 of those are Copic, 1 of those is Blick. That's why I'm a big proponent of, so there's our 042. That's why I'm a big proponent of working with the colors that you like. You don't have to be brand loyal. None of these companies are specifically paying any of us, maybe a few people, but they're not paying me and they're probably not paying you to only use their markers. So use the markers you like. Then I'm switching over to Prismacolor. I'm using PB27. And I'm blending that back out with our 042 to kind of soften the transition. So I'm going from more yellow, warmer greens to more blue, cooler greens as we go from our highlights to our shadows. And I'm going to use the same color palette almost for her choker. I'm starting with 042, then I'm moving on to PB25, and then I'm going to use PB181. And I'm going to use the same colors for her braces as well, because I like to do kind of, when I say limited color palettes, I mean, obviously you guys see I brought out all the markers in the whole world. I have a problem with using way too many markers in a single piece. There is no economy of line here, but generally I try to reuse the same colors over and over again. So here's where I wouldn't say I made a mistake, I just changed my mind. I started with some pinks for her collar because I thought that would be very 80s. So I'm using 145, 013, RV04 and RV06 for the pinks on her collar. But as I look at it and it kind of sits with me and I color other things and I color the cherries on her shirt, I realize that's not really the color I want to go with for her collar. So even though I swatched it and it looked good in the swatches, and even though it was in my notes, I still changed my mind later, but I gave myself the time to think about it. For her overalls, I wanted kind of that like 90s faded denim look. So I'm starting with PB 202. Then I'm going to move on to PB 48. And I'm building up my colors and blending them back so that we do get some softer highlights, but it's not like shiny material. It's more like a soft material that's gently reflecting the light. So kind of like denim reflecting the light. Then I'm using 556. So that is a Blick Studio color. And these are all colors that at least they weren't available in Copic when I was buying a bunch of Copics. I know Copic has introduced new colors, but also there's been issues with availability and certain stores not re-upping their stock once Copic changed hands. So I've just been using more and more markers that I can easily get in the US. Then I use 074 to start adding in my shadow and blending that back out with our 566. So for the gold tones on her choker, I'm using PB23, PB131, and PB19, as well as PB18, I believe. But I go ahead and I switch over to our reds. I started out with R000, then I moved on to R08, and then I use R27 and R39 to add in our shadows. And this is when I start rethinking that pink, because the red just fits a lot better and the pink kind of clashes with the red. Now the red would have been more of a color palette that I remember from the 90s, because there was a time period where everybody was obsessed with cherries. I think as clairs and icing became more ubiquitous, that kind of iconography became more popular with teenage girls at the time. I'm also kind of blending back, or I'm adding another layer to my shirt because I felt like it just wasn't saturated enough and the blends weren't clean enough. So I'm starting again, probably I'm starting with YG quadruple 0, then moving back in with YG00. This is actually after I'd gone to sleep for the night, come back to it the next morning and had fresh eyes and could kind of reevaluate what I did and make some decisions on how I wanted to change and adjust it. So then I'm using PB25 or PB27, it's hard to tell from here, to start knocking in some of those shadows and then blending them back out a little bit. And then going in with PB181 to add in some of those shadows again. And then to really get the shadows, I'm using PB33? No, I'm using BG13, sorry, because it's a Copic. So all of these brands have different number and family schemes, and that actually makes it easy once you're familiar with them to know which markers I'm using. If it starts with a PB, it's a Prismacolor brush. If it starts with just a letter, it is a Copic. And if it starts with a number, it is a Blick. So I'm still kind of fiddling around with the pink on the collar, still kind of thinking about it, and I'm going to start on the clips. So for the yellow hair clip, I believe I started with 337, then maybe 441, and then 014. And then for the purple clip, I think I grabbed from the iris colors. So I think I started with PB127 and ended up around PB57. I'm sorry, my notes for those aren't as good, but that's one of the reasons I recommend that you guys swatch. So I wanted to introduce some darker freckles. As someone who has freckles herself, you get some that have kind of faded out over time and then some that are kind of darker. So I introduced some hazelnuts so that we can get some of those darker freckles. Then for the background, I wanted to use some of the same colors that I used in the foreground. So I am starting with BG13, a Copic color, for our teal things. Then I am introducing PB25 for our bright lime green or neon green things. And I'm kind of establishing the colors first. Then, oh, it's a Copic, but I think it's maybe Y11 or Y15. It looks more like Y15. And then I've got a hot pink. So this was one of the collar colors. And it might be RV04. You guys can probably see better than I can because I'm doing this on my phone. So basically, I wanted to create kind of an ombre effect with the shapes as well. So I'm selecting a slightly darker color, blending it out with the prior color, and just kind of using that technique so that we get those soft transitions and we can adjust the colors. And as with every illustration, we hit the stage where we're kind of just going around, grabbing different colors, adjusting different things as we need to. So this is kind of the refinement stage. It's hard for me to kind of walk you guys through this because it's just a matter of taste. You might have thought it looked good where it was and you wouldn't have taken it any further. You might have totally reworked the thing from this point. It kind of just depends on what you want from your illustration and your level of taste. So I'm adding some lighter colors into her eyes so we get kind of that duochromatic anime-esque sort of effect. I'm adding some darker greens and some gray into her braces, and then I decided I'd let it sit for a while, that I wanted to rework the skin a lot, add in a lot more shadow, add in a lot more depth because it was reading as a very flat. So that's another instance of letting it sit for a few hours and then thinking about it and coming back to it and being able to make some significant changes and improvements. So if you feel like your work never improves, one of the things that might be going on is you might not be giving yourself enough time on a piece to actually see how you could improve it and actually implement those changes. And when we're just pumping out art for social media, that is a legitimate danger of hitting a plateau very early on because you just don't have time to spend looking at your pieces or reflecting on how you can improve them because there's such a push to constantly update. So what I really wanted to fix at this point was her skin. I wanted to add in more depth. I wanted to add in more saturation. I wanted to add in more contrast. So I added in a lot more shadow around her eyes to kind of push them back because her face was looking very, very flat. So I could swear it was a Copic that I used, but it was a darker color. So I probably used E00 and then worked my way darker from there. I'm also kind of readjusting the blush, readjusting the hair color. I'm going in with a darker red, so that looks like maybe R27 to start adding in some more shadows to her hair, and I'm using R39 to add in some more shadows to her mouth. And this is where I decided that red for the collars and the sleeves would make a lot more sense and would look a lot better. So I'm just coloring on top of my pink, starting with R05, then moving on to R27, and then finally ending with R39. Nope, I lied to you guys. I'm introducing a color I haven't written down. I'm sorry, it's a Blick, the violet, the same color I used for the shadows on her skin. Then I move on to R39. So at this point, I want to readjust the contrast a little bit, and a great way to do that in a very simple way is just to re-ink areas that need just a little bit more definition and a little bit more contrast. One of the downsides to the Tombow Fudenosuke brush pens is that they can lose a lot of their color impact as you add alcohol marker on top of them. So this is a good way to kind of go back and reestablish that. Going way back to what I mentioned earlier, where some artists will print out like a colored line art, like a digital colored line art, and then marker right on top of that, is that after they've done that, they'll go ahead and go back and then ink on that where necessary. And that's a technique that I'm really interested in exploring in the future. The downside to that for me is that by creating these line arts, I can share them with my patrons, and that way we can actually work on these art pieces together, and it's just a little extra incentive to join me over on Patreon. But I could probably share the PSD and just explain how I'm going about the process, and then maybe we could explore a new technique together. So that could be its own cool thing. So this is another part of the process where it's really about your taste level. I'm showing it because I want you guys to see that at any stage, you can reevaluate, you can change things, you can adjust things. There isn't like a particular set way of doing this that is always 100% the best way. While those kind of routines and rhythms can be really comforting, and they can be really useful if you have to produce a lot of art very quickly, like for a convention, or you're filling an Etsy shop or something like that, it can also be very reductive because it kind of locks you into very step 1, step 2, step 3 ways of thinking. And then it can feel like you're blocked out of reevaluating and making changes to your art as you see fit. So with my walkthroughs and my tutorials, I always want to encourage you guys to make whatever revisions you see necessary, whatever revisions you feel like you need to make. If inking it again to kind of clean up the line art and hide some of the places where your art might have gotten outside the lines, like I'm doing here for the background, if that helps, if it makes your art look cleaner, if it makes the lines look better, if it adds that contrast that your work needs, then you should not feel bad about doing it. You shouldn't give it a second thought. Just do it if you feel like it makes you happy, if you feel like it's going to take your art to where you want it to go. And speaking of taking your art to where you want it to go, no illustration, whether watercolor or alcohol marker, that I do is complete without being graced by the gouache gods. So I'm using some white gouache to add in a variety of highlights and accents just to kind of pop that contrast. So the white gouache is going to add kind of our lightest layer back in, and that's going to readjust the contrast. It's going to make everything appear more shiny. It's also going to make everything appear more vibrant, and it's going to make our darker colors seem a little bit more dark because it provides that necessary contrast. And I have to admit, I honestly try to keep my hair and my nose out of the shot. I really do, and I will often crop them out in post because I know that can be really distracting. But I tend to get really on top of my art so I can see what I'm doing better. And while I often wear glasses while I'm working, sometimes that's not quite enough. So if you find it distracting to see my nose or my hair showing up in the shots, just know I'm aware of it, and it really bothers me too. I'm also going to add some white outlines around our 90s-tastic shapes. That's going to make them pop a little bit more. It's also going to flatten them out a little bit more, which I feel really lends to like the 80s/90s aesthetic vibes. So that's why I'm doing it. And I'm going to do a couple of layers of gouache because it just wasn't as opaque as I really wanted for it to be here. If you're using gouache, you're really kind of looking for the consistency of heavy cream. also kind of feel like it wouldn't be one of my illustrations without some splatter technique. Fortunately for this 80s/90s tastic illustration, that is on par. So I'm using some white gouache and a variety of different watercolor brushes, and I'm just kind of tapping on the brush to get a splatter technique for this. It would also be super cute if you wanted to do some colors. So if you wanted to introduce some alcohol inks or some watercolor to this effect, it kind of just depends on what you're looking for. Now, since those white gouache outlines kind of obscured the inked outlines that I did, I'm just going back in a few places and re-inking it just for some clarity, just to kind of clean things up. So a big thing about art, in my opinion, is making things look intentional, making it look like it was a choice you made, not an accident that happened to you. Obviously, there are types of art and instances where you want it to look like it was happy accident, total kismet, but generally, for it to look good, in general, you want it to look like it was a deliberate choice you made rather than an accident that happened to your art. So even when I make a mistake, I try to make it look intentional. So once I'm done, I carefully remove my empty washi tape at a 90-degree angle. I'm going to use some gouache to cover up some of the ink lines that were underneath our washi tape so that we have this really nice clean border. And there we have it, another alcohol marker illustration. I know on TikTok, alcohol markers get some hate. There's like a whole alcohol markers suck hashtag. Those kinds of things are cyclical. People fall in and out of love with art supplies and techniques. So that's why it's important not to make any one particular technique your god and treat it like it's the end all be all, because there is a world of cool art supplies and great art techniques out there that I encourage you to explore. There is no one art material or art style that reigns supreme above all the others, and to kind of champion just one while dissing the others is really reductive, and you're not doing yourself or other artists any favors. What's really important is learning to respect other artists and other art styles and see the good in those art styles, because then you're going to really be able to grow as an artist. I had a lot of fun coloring this with you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you're one of my patrons on Patreon, you have access to both a black and white printable of this line art as well as the colored version of this line art. And if you end up coloring it, I would love to see what you do. So please tag me at NatoSoup so I can check out your awesome art. It's been a while since I've gotten to play with alcohol markers, and I've got a bunch of illustrations in the works that I can't wait to share on Patreon and share with you guys over on YouTube. If there are any alcohol marker techniques that you're interested in seeing that I haven't yet covered on the channel, please let me know down in the comments below. I'm always interested in learning and trying out new things. And I hope you guys will keep an eye out for that OLO marker review when those markers finally come in. So if you're new here and you're not a subscriber, hi, welcome. If you enjoyed this, I've got loads more great tutorials and reviews for you guys, so make sure you click that subscribe button and maybe hit that bell notification to let YouTube know that you want to see more art goodness from me, Becca Hilburn. I hope you guys had a lot of fun. Hopefully it got you picking up your alcohol markers again, but if you used a different medium for this piece, I want to hear all about it, so let me know down in the comments below. Speaking of down below, make sure you check the description. I will have the colors that I used, the materials that I used, and I'll also have some great tutorials that I think you guys would enjoy. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and hopefully this tutorial was helpful in helping you guys make art a habit. This is only made possible with enormous thanks to my amazing patrons on Patreon. Thank you guys so much.